The 20th century was a time of incredible change, unspeakable horrors, and amazing leaps of scientific discovery. It was a century marked by events that united and divided us, from great feats to great wars, with advancements and setbacks that showed us the power of many, the power of one.
I have a dream.
A century of revolutions, evolutions, and retributions. A century made by conflicts and crimes, inventions and entertainment, politics, protests, discoveries, and disasters. We will count down the 101 events of the 20th century. Their stories form the tapestry of our history and shape the world in which we live. In this episode,
his point was, doesn't matter if this is the premier player in the world. She's a woman. Any man can beat her.
So it was silently travelling all over the globe, and it was being transmitted constantly without us even realising it was around.
The First Gulf War entrenched American military power in the heart of the Middle East.
in a small town in Texas, a shootout between a breakaway religious sect and government authorities would end in tragedy. Shaking America's trust in their government and making headlines around the world.
They may well be ATF agents. They may be trying to help those who may have come out. We have a Huey helicopter. Well, we have 2 ships.
Outside of Waco, Texas, a religious group lived on a hilltop compound.
The Branch Davidians were a break-off group from the Seventh-day Adventists, and they have a belief that the second coming of Jesus Christ is imminent, and as such are very concerned with interpreting signs and sort of symptoms of when this second coming is actually going to occur. Under David Koresh, they came to be more cut off from the rest of society, and this is when a break-off religion tends to be regarded as a cult more than a religion.
What's he gonna preach?
Seven seals.
The FBI saw Koresh as a deranged individual whose primary business was trading weapons. On the 28th of February 1993, agents from the US Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms arrived with a search warrant. Gunfire broke out, lasting for 45 minutes, the longest shootout in US law enforcement history.
So after the ATF arrived, it's not 100% agreed upon what actually happened or who fired the first shot. Whether it was the Davidians had fired and therefore killed an agent, which then leads to a massive response, or whether the ATF indeed had fired, which then led to the Davidians defending themselves.
At the end of the shooting, 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians had been killed.
Our hearts go out to these brave agents who died today in the line of duty.
ATF agents withdrew and negotiated a ceasefire via telephone.
David Koresh, pick up the phone. Negotiators are attempting to get a hold of you. They would like to speak with you.
The FBI arrived and took the lead on negotiations. A standoff stretched out over weeks. After discovering the group had stockpiled at least a year's worth of supplies, the FBI decided to tear gas the compound. US Attorney General Janet Reno agreed to the plan on the 18th of April, with the siege now in its 51st day. 6 hours after tear gassing began, flames erupted at 3 separate points in the compound. Most of the Davidians died of smoke inhalation after the fire began. Investigators found 75 bodies, including 25 children. 5 of Koresh's followers were convicted of voluntary manslaughter and firearms violations.
Branch Davidians are not anti-government. We're not anti-law enforcement. And I'm sorry that there are 4 agents that are dead, but we lost 85 friends and family too.
After Reno was criticized for authorizing tear gas, a federal investigation was launched. The inquiry exonerated the FBI, attributing the deaths solely to the actions of Koresh. Despite the findings, public confidence in the authorities was shaken.
The massive conflagration, the huge fire that is sort of burned into everybody's memories of Waco meant that the ATF and law enforcement more generally is way less gung-ho about going into a siege situation with a cult or a group of people who are sort of gathered around a particular movement or identity. Waco is seen as the kind of biggest tragedy in law enforcement in the United States.
The early 1970s. Women's campaign for equal pay was extending into the sporting arena. It was here that one female sporting legend would turn a gimmick match into an important stand. In 1973, an exhibition tennis match was arranged between two pros, one male, one female. It was touted as finally answering the question, who would win the battle of the sexes?
But all over the world, women were saying, we want equal pay, we want equal conditions of work, and we want equal reward for our endeavors, particularly in sports, where women were shamelessly paid less than men, regardless of how good they were.
The contenders were Bobby Riggs on the men's side and Billie Jean King for the women.
Billie Jean King, 5 times Wimbledon champion, selects a soft, easy-flowing Teddy Tinling creation, unlike her tennis, which is hard and devastating.
This was an important match for King. She had been part of a group of women frustrated with the wage disparity between the sexes, who had taken action by boycotting the men's tours for symbolic $1 contracts to play their own tour. Bobby Riggs was now in his mid-50s. Despite his age, Riggs still thought he could win without training.
Listen, when you play me, you'll see shots you've never seen before. I mean, I'll let you know that right now. I believe that.
Riggs was a pretty decent player in the 1940s. He'd won a Wimbledon title, he'd won a Davis Cup, but he was way past his best. He'd retired and wasn't a serious competitor any longer, and felt that things had got out of hand as far as he was concerned. When I say out of hand, he felt that women made too much progress. He liked women to be in their natural environment, that is, the home, in the kitchen specifically. And he was very outspoken about this.
Riggs had won a match against world number 1, Margaret Court, just 6 months earlier.
His point was, doesn't matter if this is the premier player in the world. She's a woman. Any man can beat her. Any guy that can hold a tennis racket can probably beat, smash the world's best woman player. So he threw down the gauntlet to Billie Jean King. Bad decision. Billie Jean was a stalwart supporter of women's rights, had got a brilliant record, had won 3 slams the year before the actual Battle of the Sexes.
More than 30,000 fans filled the aerodrome, eager to see who would be victorious. It is also estimated that 90 million people watched from home. King won convincingly. She was at the top of her game and had not stopped training in the lead up to the match.
Had said before the match that I was going to win it, that there'd be no contest, and I was wrong. She said that they were going to scrape me off the floor of the Astrodome. They didn't quite have to do that, but almost.
King received a huge spike in sponsorship and co-founded the Women's Players Union and a not-for-profit advocacy group for female athletes. After King's win, there was a boom in women's sport.
Even though there was a freakish feel about the event, there was a symbolic quality to it. And by putting the guy in his place and frankly rubbing his nose in it, she delivered a fantastic blow for the feminist cause in its day.
To the Queen of Tennis.
I bet you my head's too big.
When Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in as President of the United States in 1933, he inherited an economy in tatters and millions of unemployed citizens. His response would change the American political and social landscape for generations.
Let me assert my firm belief
that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Black Tuesday had hit Wall Street on the 29th of October 1929. The first in a series of economic crises that led to financial devastation that the 20th century wouldn't see again. By 1933, in the grip of the Great Depression, America's GDP had fallen by almost 29%. Banking and credit systems were paralyzed. Soup kitchens, unemployment queues, and desperation were the daily challenges for millions of Americans. Roosevelt campaigned on a ticket of economic reform.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
Roosevelt takes office at a moment of unprecedented economic crisis. The banks are failing, mass unemployment 25%, farm prices are going through the floor. And Roosevelt doesn't have the answer, so the first thing that he sets out to do is to restore the confidence of the people in the government.
Winning by a landslide, Roosevelt went straight to work to make good on his reform campaign promises.
But we are on our way.
In his first 100 days as president, he introduced major new laws. His work projects aimed to pull millions of unemployed Americans back to work by building roads, bridges, libraries, schools and parks all around the country.
Work that conserves the soil and replenishes the forests.
Cultural projects were supported too.
Roosevelt famously remarked at one point, well, even artists are unemployed and we need to help them.
Under the Works program, musicians, artists, writers and actors contribute their share to the cultural development of the community.
For Roosevelt, the most important reform was the Social Security Act of 1935, creating an insurance system for the aged, unemployed, disabled and retired workers.
The public believes, too, that old age security should be a function of government.
Then, round about 1935, when he's been in office for 2 years, he switches to a bottom-up approach, trying to build up trade union power, give rights at the bottom of the economic pile, improve relief work.
Despite its ambitions, Roosevelt's New Deal didn't end the economic depression, but it did have lasting effects.
First and foremost, it demonstrated that the federal government's presence in the economy and in society was essential. Secondly, it made the presidency the central and driving force of the American political system. Since Roosevelt came to office in 1933, the strong presidency has been a central assumption of American politics, and Americans look to their presidents for leadership.
So Mr. Roosevelt is renominated and will probably be re-elected.
On the 2nd of August 1990, the international community was shaken when Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his army across the border into neighboring Kuwait.
Well, the initial pretext for the invasion on 2nd of August 1990 was two things. Firstly, demarcation disputes over the exact border between Kuwait and Iraq. Second source of contention was the slant drilling of the Kuwaitis under the border into Iraqi oil reserves. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and in the space of about 12 hours, the country was completely overrun and the Kuwaiti leadership fled.
Iraq's army was well equipped, as the US had provided military aid during the 8-year war with Iran. Kuwait was a major supplier of oil to the US. The Iraqi takeover also posed an immediate threat to Saudi Arabia, another major exporter of oil. If Saudi Arabia fell to Saddam, Iraq would control 1/5 of the world's oil supply. US President George H.W. Bush took immediate action.
At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
The US sought multilateral support from the United Nations Security Council.
He sends another $250,000 US troops, continues drumming up support for what would eventually become a 35-member coalition that were involved in military actions.
After months of build-up, President Bush issued an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein. Leave Kuwait by the 15th of January 1991, or face a full attack by the multinational force. When the deadline passed, the operation initially called Desert Shield became Desert Storm. US bombing raids were followed by a swift ground war. It took Allied ground troops only 100 hours to declare Kuwait liberated.
America and the world drew a line in the sand, and tonight, America and the world have kept their word.
The environmental and economic damage to the ravaged Kuwait was devastating. It was the world's first live televised war. Americans saw footage from cameras placed on smart bombs as they struck Iraqi targets. The brevity of the action was a boost to US morale, reinforcing its status as the world's leading superpower.
The first Gulf War entrenched American military power in the heart of the Middle East. All of that would be extremely important in terms of the United States' capacity to project itself militarily in the region and protect and enhance the flow of petroleum products.
After perhaps unparalleled international consultation, it became necessary to take this action.
The swift US victory of Operation Desert Storm unsettled the political balance in the Middle East in ways that remain dangerous and unresolved into the 21st century. Humans have been modifying crops and livestock for tens of thousands of years to improve crop quality and make produce more resistant to adverse events and reap more bountiful harvests. But it was in the 20th century that crop modification entered a completely new area. The 1935 discovery of DNA, the building blocks of life, was a major step towards the creation of genetically modified crops.
The first is probably the discovery of restriction enzymes that enabled us to cut up the DNA of organisms into gene-sized pieces. The second one would be the ability to clone those genes up into large copies. And the third one, to the ability to introduce them using a vector into the recipient organism. In the case of plants, through an organism called agrobacterium, which naturally infects the plant and inserts its own DNA into the plant genome. And we are able to use that to carry a particular gene into the genome.
Despite its great significance in the agricultural sector, some of the earliest GMO patents were not related to farming. The Exxon Oil Company was awarded a patent in 1982 that allowed them to develop an oil-eating microorganism to be used in oil spills. The first agricultural GM patent was an antibiotic-resistant tobacco plant produced in 1983. Opportunities were now opening up to create seed strains resistant to drought, disease, and pests. Scientists inserted genes into soybeans, ultimately creating what would become the most common GMO, herbicide-resistant soybeans. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, other GMO seeds followed for potatoes, cotton, rice, sugarcane, and tomatoes.
One of the first ones would have been the Flavor Saver tomato, which was developed by Calgene in the United States. There, the goal was to produce a later ripening tomato, and that was done by introduction of a foreign gene.
The Flavor Saver tomato arrived on US grocery shelves in 1994 after being approved by the Food and Drug Administration in May of that year. Genetic modification delayed its ripening mechanism, giving it a longer shelf life.
It was not a commercial success. That was in the time of very much uncertain consumer reaction to genetically engineered products.
Almost as soon as the GMO products became available in supermarkets and grocery stores, public concerns were growing about their health effects, including increased allergies and resistance to antibiotics.
We think that is very dangerous for the environment problem, also for the farmers all over the world, and also for the health of everybody.
So it's not so much the technology which is the risky aspect. In fact, many scientific committees have found that the technology does not represent a greater risk than over conventional breeding. It's important to focus on what gene is introduced into the plant and what characteristic that confers on the plant.
Despite concerns, GMO food crops have become widespread by the end of the 20th century. And with the planet's growing population, it seems that GMO food crops are set to be the way of the future.
Farms like Gary Adams' spread outside Fairfield, Iowa, are planted with genetically modified crops. Like the tractor, GM seeds are viewed by Gary Adam and many US farmers as another technological tool to help them get the most out of their land.
In the next 15 years, we'll have another 1 billion people in that period. It's just not going to be fast enough to improve our agriculture to keep up with that demand. So it really opens up the range of techniques that breeders can use, the extent of variation they can take from nature to improve the crop plants that we use as staples for our food.
He was an emotional artist who explored his personal world through his painting. His work defined a movement, his influence defined by a painting that shocked and inspired the art world. Spanish painter Pablo Picasso first came to Paris in 1901. It was here that he would release some of his most influential work. In 1907, he produced a provocative piece depicting prostitutes from a Paris brothel he frequented. This was La Demoiselle d'Avignon, a groundbreaking painting and the culmination of Picasso's emotional and artistic influences at the time. His relationship with his longtime model and lover, Fernand Olivier, had just ended. His idol, the influential painter Cézanne, had died. Picasso sought to memorialize Cézanne's techniques and show his own artistic rivals what he could do.
One can really get a sense of where Picasso is coming from. Here we think we have 5 images of women, but in fact what we have is one woman shown in 5 different perspectives. Picasso wants to show everything. He's hungry for everything. He doesn't want to show you the woman from face on. He wants to show every single aspect of her.
The controversial work is regarded as one of the first expressions of the movement known as Cubism.
Cubism is a very interesting movement.
As everyone knows, Picasso can be difficult, but people in the money want his work. Here's still life with a candle, to take an easier example.
Picasso is trying to get to the absolute essence of reality. And to understand how he's doing this when it seems such an extraordinary image, the object has melted away. It has no substance. The colors are reduced to grays and browns. What's recognizable about it? How can we say this is reality?
Picasso's legacy stretches all the way to the present. His signature can be found in conceptual art and performance art, both of which aim to give objects and people new meaning.
No longer the tradition of rendering something in a naturalistic manner, but in a way where there are multiple perspectives and multiple things that can happen at once.
On the day La Demoiselle d'Avignon first exhibited, Picasso opened a new world, understood by a new way of thinking. His work and legacy was revolutionary, connecting art with mind and influencing artists for generations to come. We had been to the moon, but the vast reaches of space still lay beyond our reach. This changed with the launch of a telescope that could reveal the wonders of our universe.
The moon is our nearest neighbor, and the telescope shows it to be a very mountainous body.
Space telescopes weren't a new invention in the space age, and it was really a way to solve the problems that we have on Earth. So the Earth's atmosphere blocks lots of colors of light, so we are very limited what we can see with our eyes. And there's a lot more to discover.
The Hubble telescope was launched in 1990 to see further than land-based telescopes, measure distances to far-off galaxies, and take pictures of what it saw.
Where scientists have had to rely on sometimes ill-defined photographs of deep space, there will now be high-resolution images.
The new telescope would not be affected by the blur of the Earth's atmosphere, and it would see all types of rays that were normally blocked.
The Hubble Space Telescope, powered by 2 huge solar panels, will be able to detect objects so far away that they'll be seen as they were 15 billion years ago.
Once the launch mission was completed, the images were disappointing. It was not until it had been installed in an orbit around the Earth that the engineers saw the problem.
How was this multi-billion, yes, billion-dollar instrument having kind of terrible images? And they realized that they actually polished the mirror too much. And so a rigorous and a huge effort of engineers, scientists, astronomers for a year was planned to build something to change the mirror, what we call COSTAR. And that was a correction, a series of little lenses to correct for the image.
The repair mission also proved that the telescope could be fixed and modified while in space. Over the years, there would be several other repair missions. The telescope, named after Edwin Hubble for his pioneering work in proving the universe is expanding and for discovering galaxies beyond our own, took 70 years to go from an idea to reality, and now, every day, it sends Earth new material. Its time in space has given the world spectacular images. The telescope had also provided the inspiration and information for 15,000 scientific papers in multiple areas of research. The knowledge gained by the use of the telescope is astounding, dramatically increasing the possibilities of space exploration.
The Hubble Space Telescope has changed our understanding of every part of space and astronomy. It's discovered the universe was accelerating. It's measured the most accurate measurements of how fast the universe was growing, and then did it again. It's discovered that there's billions and trillions of galaxies. It found that black holes and active black holes can actually shoot things to it. It's discovered distant quasars and gamma ray bursts. It literally has done everything. Every discovery that we think about in modern day astronomy has data from the Hubble Space Telescope.
Eventually, the viewing days of Hubble will expire, and it will fall back through the atmosphere to be replaced by a new telescope that will continue its exploratory work, contributing to humankind's understanding of our own world and beyond. In the second half of the 20th century, a confluence of events would inflame long-held differences, sparking years of bloodshed and violence in Lebanon.
The damage is not confined to material objects. Lebanon's political mold has been shattered too.
Lebanon, who had received its independence from France in 1943, initially thrived despite its religiously sensitive environment.
Lebanon's a complex, multi-religious society. It has 18 recognised ethno-religious communities that were recognised in the National Pact of 1943, which established the ground rules, if you will, for the formation of Lebanon as an independent country and the power-sharing relationship between those 18 recognised religious communities.
By 1975, the best attempts to combine the groups deteriorated into an exchange of bullets.
Like all civil wars, they don't just start. The antecedent conditions were there for the Lebanese Civil War in the lead up to 1975, when it formally started. The common spark that's often identified was a massacre of a busload of Palestinians by Falangist militiamen. But of course the Phalangists would argue that it was retribution for the shooting of 2 prominent members of the Christian community coming outside from a church.
We are ready for a long war.
If the war will take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, we are ready to fight.
15 years fighting followed the two attacks. Religious conflict boiling over between the many Christian and Muslim sects.
Though the Christians began the present round of fighting last April, their war is basically a defensive one.
It was hard for the Maronite Christians, Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims of the previous French-held country to reconcile, despite each religious group holding one of three main parliamentary roles: Prime Minister, President and Parliamentary Speaker. The policy would have to make room for change, however, as masses of Christians fled the country, leaving them without a president for a full year. Both Syrian and Israeli armies became involved in the war and stayed for the duration, holding their positions until the early 2000s. Peace attempts failed and wars continued, religious factions fighting within themselves. The Civil War was not a single conflict, but many clashes of larger groups dividing into small ones that turned on each other. Finally, the Syrian army stormed the presidential palace at Baghdad late in 1990, ending the fighting, but not the issue that led to it. Unrest had lessened, but not disappeared. The years of strife and the time that followed it remain an impediment to religious cooperation.
Even if the present crisis is overcome, the prospects for united and peaceful Lebanon appear bleak.
The long-lasting effects on Lebanon, not least 150,000 dead and more than 70,000 disappeared, and then about a fifth or a million people emigrated from the country. So yes, a mass emigration. And this, of course, also changed the demographics of the country.
For centuries, traders sought a faster way to move goods and people between the east and west coasts of America. A problem solved by an unparalleled feat of engineering, one that took 20th century technology to achieve. The French tried to build a canal through the Central American nation of Panama in the 1880s, but they had been prevented by a lack of technology and the spread of disease amongst the workers. A few decades later, the United States took up the challenge.
The United States was starting to see itself for the first time really as a global power. From the point of view of commerce, they wanted to actually get a faster way to get goods from the east of America to the east of the world.
In 1904, construction resumed, with the builders facing the same challenges that had defeated the French.
I had a very difficult environment to work in, and in a sense the difficulty was about really a swelling river that they had to deal with, because once they started to cut, the river, as it would actually swell with the rains, it would actually start to remove most of actually the soil. So they're getting a lot of landslides they had to deal with.
A year passed following the same route until a new chief engineer took over. Under railroad specialist John Stevens, the design was changed from a sea-level canal to a lock system to improve progress and make the plan more viable. However, the scale of the task remained daunting.
If you could imagine about an 8-mile long gap that had to actually be excavated to about 100 meters, that was some challenge. You then actually have up to 40,000 people trying to actually house them to create these almost instant villages, and that gives you some of the scale in terms of maybe what had to be done.
The project took 10 years to complete and has become one of the 7 wonders of the modern world.
Uncle Sam moves his fleet from the Pacific to the Atlantic, the greatest peacetime movement in naval history.
It cuts thousands of miles from the trip around South America, significantly improving communications between countries on either side of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. The structure is also a feat of political and international cooperation.
It was done often against huge political odds, with a lot of political interference. It was a multinational operation under quite sharp military discipline.
Strategically, the canal still has importance. The Defense Department says it's needed for quick transfer and resupply of U.S. forces.
For America, this at the time was like sending a man to the moon. It was an immense achievement.
Today, the canal is used by at least 25 countries, a feat of human determination and ingenuity that continues to play an important role in globalization, shortening sea voyages and expanding global trade routes that link countries and continents. By the 1970s, the developed world, especially the United States, was increasingly dependent on oil. American production could not keep pace with American consumption, a disparity that would soon be used against them. Many oil-producing countries were members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, founded in 1960. When the Yom Kippur War began on the 6th of October 1973, Arab members of OPEC sought to punish countries that supported Israel in the conflict.
So the 1973 oil crisis was initiated by the Arab states in OPEC to voice their collective displeasure at support for Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So they were very specific in their embargo. It was against the United States, the UK, Netherlands, and Japan. And they also implemented a price raise for the rest of the world.
When the Israelis accept to withdraw from the occupied territories and the US government guarantees their decision, then immediately we can lift the embargo.
Though Arab-Israeli hostilities ended on October 22nd, the embargo continued. Prices rose quickly, from $3 to $12 per barrel within 3 months of the embargo, and prices at the pump doubled, causing outrage and protests from truck drivers and nationwide restrictions in the US and across Europe and elsewhere.
America's energy demands have grown so rapidly that they now outstrip our energy supplies. As a result, we face the possibility of temporary fuel shortages and some increases in fuel prices in America.
Fuel was rationed. In some cases, petrol stations closed on Sundays, and in others, cars could only fuel up on certain days.
The US had never conceived of oil as a weapon. It was always a commodity. The basis of the global economy, everyone needed affordable oil to keep everyone's economy going. So this was quite a shock.
In Britain, the public was encouraged to heat only one room in their house. In the States, Oregon banned Christmas lights. The national speed limit was reduced to 55 miles per hour to avoid excess fuel consumption, and daylight saving came into effect year-round. The impact of surging oil prices forced a major downturn in the US economy. The US dollar dropped, and that meant overseas producers, who had set their price in US dollars, were faced with diminishing returns. America's automobile industry, which had been making big cars that relied on a lot of fuel, suffered as Japan's smaller, more oil-efficient vehicles gained in favor. The oil crisis established a new power center for fuel pricing and control of supply. Its immediate effect was to drive up prices. Its longer-term effects have been far more diverse.
So it really drove investments into renewables, into wind, into solar. This is the first time that you see in the US the environmental conservation movement in sync with national security requirements. So it was quite interesting at the time to have these two camps on the same side.
Although much of the world had been caught by surprise and had realized their vulnerability, the 1973 oil crisis opened pathways that were previously thought uneconomical and paved the way for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and exploration of new oil reserves. A transfer of sovereignty that was 15 years in the making, ending 156 years of colonial rule and signalling the rise of a new economic superpower. Known as the Pearl of the Orient, Hong Kong Island was first ceded by China after the First Opium War in 1842.
What the British did was that they took over what was known as an island, which not many people living there, mostly a fishing village. Even the British saw it as this barren rock, but they took over and claimed it. And in 1842, when the peace treaty is signed, the Treaty of Nanjing, among other things, declared that Hong Kong is now part of the British Empire.
Political upheavals in mainland China, first in 1911 and then in 1950, contributed to its increasing population and growing economy. Talks between Britain and China began in 1982, and Beijing insisted that ownership of Hong Kong was non-negotiable, demanding its return along with the new territories.
Perhaps naively, Margaret Thatcher, who of course was no fan of the Chinese Communist Party, suggested that perhaps a lease could be renewed, that perhaps it was in the interest of China that Hong Kong should remain under the rule of the British to continue its thriving economic development. That of course laid bare the very naive understanding of the British of what Hong Kong really meant for China. For the Chinese, Hong Kong was a symbol of humiliation. Not only was it a symbol of humiliation, it was part of that unfinished mission that China had to be unified under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party.
China has put out an information film about Hong Kong, emphasizing the overcrowding and the hectic pace of life there. But China has agreed that the Western lifestyle of Hong Kong will remain unchanged for 50 years after its return to the mainland.
Deng Xiaoping's one country, two systems policy allowed Hong Kong's capitalist economy to sit alongside China's communist state. An agreement was reached for Hong Kong to be formally returned to China on the 1st of July, 1997.
The British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, exchanged the final documents in December with the Chinese Prime Minister, Zhao Ziyang.
Despite the pledges of the Chinese government, concerns grew after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing. Regardless, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher remained committed to the joint declaration.
So, the fact that we still had a British colony in Hong Kong up until 1997 is a good example of how colonialism still existed in Asia up until that period. And again, stark reminder of how something that we would have thought was very much part of the past was still part of everyday life in China, or at least in Hong Kong, up until the end of the 20th century.
The 30th of June 1997 marked the last day of British rule. The handover officially began at 11:30 p.m.
Britain is part of Hong Kong's history, and Hong Kong is part of Britain's history. We are also part of each other's future. We are confident that the ties between us will not only endure, but will continue to develop.
Minutes before midnight, the British national flag and the Hong Kong colonial flag were lowered, officially ending British colonial rule in the city of nearly 6.5 million people. A kidnapping that dominated the headlines. A baby taken from his celebrity parents' mansion. A tragedy that fame and fortune could not prevent. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh shot to international stardom as the first man to fly non-stop across the Atlantic.
The first solo transatlantic flight, it took him 33 hours. Back home once more, he received a hero's welcome in New York. It was crowds and cheering all the way.
In the late 1920s, early 30s, Charles Lindbergh was as big a global celebrity as you can imagine.
But fame was no protection when his first child, Charles Jr., the eaglet, disappeared from his New Jersey estate.
It was from this house at Hopewell, New Jersey, Colonel Lindbergh's home, that the kidnapping of his baby son that shocked the world in March 1932 took place.
A crudely written ransom note demanding $50,000 was found on the window ledge of the baby's room, with a folding ladder propped outside. New Jersey State Police assumed charge of the investigation, which was severely hampered by Lindbergh's determination to negotiate with the kidnappers and by the surrounding media storm.
The 1930s was the era when the mass media had really come into its own. The Lindbergh case was very serious news. I mean, it dominated the headlines all over the United States and later across the world.
It was a long, drawn-out event, this whole kidnapping saga. H.L. Mencken, who was a famous journalist of the day, said that the kidnapping trial was a bigger story than the resurrection.
A ransom of $50,000 was paid by an intermediary, but the baby wasn't returned. The hunt continued until May, when a truck driver discovered partially buried remains in a wood only a few miles from the Lindbergh mansion.
I am the guy that found Lindbergh's baby.
A medical examination revealed the baby had died from a blow to the head 2 months earlier, at the time of his disappearance. With the baby's death, the only cause remaining was to find the culprit. A breakthrough came after a gold certificate, which had made up part of the ransom, was traced back to a gas station, where a suspicious attendant took note of the customer's license plate number. Police followed the lead to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who was arrested, and the subsequent trial of the century began on the 2nd of January 1935. It lasted for 5 weeks. The jury found Hauptmann guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. As a direct consequence of the case, in June 1932, the US Congress passed the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping across state lines a federal felony. Interest in the case lasted for decades.
In the broader sweep of the 20th century, I think probably is best seen as a media event, as an early form of celebrity politics, celebrity justice, and media politics, fed by radio, but of course created exactly the same sort of event, concentration and publicity and hysteria that later celebrity trials such as O.J. Simpson generated 50 years later.
Decades later, the questions remain, and one family's tragedy has been enshrined in history as the crime of the 20th century. Medical discoveries of the 20th century had eradicated some of humanity's worst diseases, until a newly discovered virus exploded into the world's population, devastating lives and communities.
47 years old in 1986, a strange fishing wildfire lasted a tens of thousands of families around the world.
In the 1980s, unusual disease symptoms were being reported in the United States and Africa.
It'll probably never be known for sure when, how, and where HIV was transmitted into humans. But the most plausible and reasonable theory is called the natural selection theory, or the bushmeat theory. And that's that in Central Africa, people who were hunting monkeys and chimpanzees for food were out searching for their food, and they came across a monkey that had SIV, so that's simian immunodeficiency virus. And somewhere within that hunting, that virus jumped from simian version into a human.
By the early 80s, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, had become a known infection in the United States. The condition stemmed from the HIV virus, which attacked a person's immune system.
So what HIV does is killing us softly. So it makes it, the human body and our immune system, unable to battle things that normally we would be able to flick off at a moment's notice.
It was not until 1985, when technology had advanced, that screening was available for the disease. The National Cancer Institute of America announced that they had isolated the human immunodeficiency virus. They had been working with the Parisian Pasteur Institute to put a name to the frightening epidemic that was affecting the world and would hopefully bring a cure.
It was silently travelling all over the globe, and it was being transmitted constantly without us even realising it was around. Estimates are that about 300,000 people had HIV somewhere all over the globe at the start of the 80s.
The original at-risk categories included drug users, homosexual men, haemophiliacs, and people of Haitian origin.
When it was first described in the US in the start of the 80s, it was said to be a new infection of gay men, which it wasn't. So it not only was discrimination about this terrifying new deadly virus, that is coupled with the discrimination that comes of homophobia that was rife, and you bring them together, and that meant that there was this really delayed response to HIV research.
I am deathly afraid of AIDS disease. Anybody that says they're not afraid of AIDS is a fool or a liar.
The modern plague continued to spread. By 1995, it had become the leading cause of death for ages 25 to 44 in America. Death numbers were in the tens of thousands per year, and fear characterized the public response.
Because of the fear and ignorance about AIDS, the boys have become outcasts, shunned in their own hometown.
They see us go by their church and there's out there, it's just like they just turn their head like we never exist.
In 1996, a cocktail of drug therapies reached the market, which slowed the disease and halved the annual death rate.
So in the mid-90s, they changed the way that we were treating HIV and started doing multi-drug approaches. And that can really help knock out all different mutations and strains of the HIV virus to really keep it at bay, keep your immune system healthy so that it doesn't then develop into AIDS.
With increased knowledge and collaboration to fight against AIDS, prevention of its spread, and work towards eradication of the deadly virus, now occupies researchers around the world.